ABPAC, Australian Business and People's Alliance Council, brings you this presentation: How Queensland Democracy was Stolen by the State Government, to demonstrate the extent of power usurped by the Queensland State Government and how it has used that power over the people. Firstly, let's go back to Saturday the 15th of March 2008, when local government elections were held by the state of Queensland to amalgamate 85 shires and councils in Queensland. Prior to this, in December 2007, the federal government authorised and held plebiscites or referenda in each of these 85 shires and councils, and the results showed that an average of over 77% of voters voted no to council amalgamations. In a democracy, the results of these plebiscites would have been sufficient to stop the proposed amalgamations, because it's not what the people wanted. They gave a clear indication of their will, no to council amalgamations. But that didn't hold with Premier Anna Bligh. She said, "I don't care what the people say, we're doing it anyway." And they did. Have you ever thought what gives the Premier the right, as an elected representative of the people, the right to ignore the will of the people and ignore the basic laws of democracy in what's supposed to be a democratic society? Perhaps we should find out. In the beginning, some wise men gave Queensland a charter for its governance. They had only history and their wisdom to work out what essentials would be needed for its future prosperity. Firstly, they gave it a representative government elected by the people. Then an upper house to keep the government accountable. Also, a governor representing the Crown and overseeing to the interests of the people. They also required a judiciary representing the Crown, following the rights of common law, and finally a constitution, which was our guide to governance. Truly, they gave us a formidable structure to safeguard our democracy. So what happened?
The Queensland Labor Party removed the upper house in 1922, in spite of a referendum of May 1917, which said no.
Nevertheless, Queensland progressed soundly for some 70 years, and in the 1980s could boast one of the best public health systems in Australia, and a high level of education for its children. Then along came a spider, in the form of the Reprints Act 1992. This was enacted during the second term of Premier Wayne Goss and his right-hand man, Director General Kevin Rudd. So what did Premier Wayne Goss and his Director General Kevin Rudd want to achieve with this legislation? Let's have a look. The first item to address is what reprint really means, because it is not the act of printing a subsequent copy of an existing document. It is the rewriting of an act to incorporate change, whether the meaning or interpretation of that law is altered or not. A better name for a reprint would be a rewrite. To see how this works, let's look inside the Reprints Act of 1992. At Part 3 on page 7, we read that all amendments, especially the omission or insertion of provisions, must be included in a reprint of a law, on or before the day specified as the reprint date. It must also incorporate all necessary consequential amendments. Now, to Part 6, which explains how reprints are authorised. The Parliamentary Council must authorise the reprint of a law printed by the government printer, and the Parliamentary Council may authorise the reprint of a law that is not in printed form. Excuse me, what style of law is this that is not in printed form? Perhaps a repealed law no longer in print? But Why reprint that unless it could then be used to effect a change that would otherwise be prohibited? Or perhaps a law that has not and may not be given assent. If you reprint it, the reprint is given effect by the Parliamentary Council. You may not need assent. Or is it just a figment of the imagination of those in power that must be materialised to fulfil a need? All that is needed to show authorisation is a note on the reprint stating that the Parliamentary Council has authorised it, whether they have or not. And the onus is on anyone to prove otherwise. To spec the reprint has, go to Part 7, which tells us that the text of the law in a reprint is taken to be correct. And as with authorisation, the text is correct in the absence of evidence to the contrary. And a court or person acting judicially must take judicial notice of a purported reprint. No proof that this is the law. It's up to you to prove it isn't. How powerful is stealth? The law can be changed simply by creating a reprint in which the text of a law is altered to achieve whatever you want it to achieve, because the law is amended or referred to having regard for the text shown in the latest reprint or in any subsequent reprint, and a person or court acting judicially must take judicial notice of it. Here is an act allowing the law to be amended, simply by the omission or insertion of provisions, or by the changing of a few words, to impact on the interpretation and or the effect of the law. This is the covert process of reprinting. It is made possible by the Reprints Act of 1992. The question we have to ask, is it legal? And of course we want to know how it was used. The answer to this part is quite straightforward. It was used to effect changes in legislation retrospectively, to remove safeguards in legislation such as referenda, separation of powers, and being subject to the Australian Constitution. This process was very simple and very effective. But we still have to ask the question, was it legal? Let us come back to the question of how it was used, how it was applied by the state government to amend past legislation. We also have to note that the changes targeted were legislation that prevented the state government from taking total control over the state of Queensland, and that legislation was then duly processed through the system of reprinting, under the radar and without detection. The process of manipulating legislation to establish the acts and laws necessary to give the state government the required power base was done simply by reprinting the legislation and, where necessary, having it rubber stamped by the governor. The mechanism is represented by this simple graphic. Let's assume we want to change some legislation. In order to achieve the required result in today's legislation here, what we have to do is to look at the legislation that preceded it and see how it affects it and how these constraints can be removed. Once these changes are identified, the appropriate changes can be effected by putting the amendments in reprints of the subject legislation. And this can change the meaning and the intent of that legislation from outset. The amended legislation now allows for new acts and laws to be passed right now that would have been prohibited under the legislation as originally structured. This results in legislation with unbridled power today over an unsuspecting community. The Reprints Act of 1992 allowed this mechanism to be used from 1992 until the present day to take total control and establish draconian rule by the state government. The Reprints Act was put into effect by ALP Premier Wayne Goss and appears to have been a preparatory action, laying the foundation on which future ALP state governments would build their strategy. This was to take control over the people of Queensland and deprive them of their democratic rights. And what was achieved through the Reprints Act by its main exponents? What manipulation of legislation did they achieve? Let's have a look. The most important aspect of what was achieved to us was that our safeguards to our democracy were removed. The upper house had been removed unlawfully in 1922. So the safeguards we were left with were the Queensland Constitution of 1867, the Governor, the Judiciary and the Crown, all of which were separate powers from the Parliament. The most brash move against any of this would be against the Constitution. But how can it be that the Constitution of Queensland of 1867 was manipulated, having been assented to by the ruling monarch, Queen Victoria, and being a covenant between the monarchy and the people of Queensland, by which the monarchy guarantees the rights and liberties of the people? Simple. You create and use legislation that is specifically engineered to enable you to do just that. Also, you ignore whether that legislation was effected lawfully or unlawfully, knowing that it will pass by the judiciary without mention. Such an act is the Australia Act 1986. It is better specified as Act number 142 of 1985. To better understand the manipulation that is the Australia Act 1986, we must first understand what it is and also what it does. To understand what it is, we simply refer to the preamble and we see that this is an act to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the States into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. Now, the important words we look at here are constitutional arrangements, meaning that this matter affects every single Australian and surely must be subject to a referendum. So how did they do it? Well, instead of a referendum, Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister of the time, and the then Premiers of the States decided for you. In the second paragraph of the preamble, it states very clearly that whereas the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth and the Premiers of the States at conferences held in Canberra on 24 and 25 June 1982 and 21 June 1984 agreed on the taking of certain measures to bring the constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the States into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. They arranged for legislation to be passed by each state, the Australia Act Request Acts of 1985, and using Section 51 of the Constitution, claiming that all the parliaments of all the states have requested this act. They enacted this act and locked up your future. Now, in the first instance, this doesn't appear to do anything wrong. As Australians, we value our rights and liberties, and the concept of affirming the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation would appeal to most of us. But that's where the appeal ends. Under scrutiny, we find that this act doesn't unite us. It divides our nation into states. The burning question is, what was the intent of such an act? Why was such legislation required? The Commonwealth of Australia was in good shape and our rights and liberties were well entrenched in the common law and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia.
To try and understand, let's look for a clue in a speech made to the Fabian Society in 1984 by one of its members, the Prime Minister of the day, the Honourable Bob Hawke. Here's a transcript of some of his speech. Let's see what he has to say.
But 1947 was also a year when the challenge against bank nationalisation forced on us a realisation of the restrictions and restraints imposed by the Constitution, and in particular by Section 92. Consequently, this led to a rethinking of our approach.
Please note that the Australia Act did not arise in the 80s. It was born of a need in 1947, a need to follow a socialist agenda of nationalising banking, which could not be continued because of the restrictions and restraints of our Constitution. Let's read on.
Because unless the platform was just to stagnate into irrelevance, the search had to be made for alternative means of achieving our objectives. In that search, and it was a search and a development of policy that went on for more than 20 years, Fabians were in the forefront. Fabians like Frank Crean, Jim Cairns, Tim Beazley, Race Matthews, and not least our own Fabius Maximus, Gough Whitlam himself. From his own words, Bob Hawke admitted that the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia did not allow them to follow an agenda they had chosen for Australia, a socialist agenda. What they do is they had to find an alternative means of achieving our objectives. Now, it's important to note that this is our objectives and not Commonwealth of Australia objectives. We should know that the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia has established our rights, the rights of the people of the Commonwealth of Australia. Now, this was very clearly affirmed by a former Chief Justice of the High Court when he stated, "To establish a right in a constitution is to deny to a democratically elected parliament the power to make a law inconsistent with that right. The whole point of having a constitutional right is to put it beyond the reach of Parliament." Chief Justice Murray Gleeson, November 2000. How do you overcome this? And another High Court judge has stated, "The Constitution's limitation or confinement of Commonwealth and state laws and powers give rise to an immunity on the part of the citizen from being adversely affected by those laws or the exercise of those powers." Yet we have seen that Crown Law Queensland declared in the Supreme Court of Queensland, "There can be no doubt that the Queensland Parliament may validly enact laws which adversely affect the interests, rights and property of persons, whether of prospective or retrospective effect, with or without compensation." What gives them the right? On the one hand, we have a High Court judge stating that under the Constitution people have an immunity from being adversely affected by laws and the exercise of parliamentary powers. On the other hand, there's Queensland Crown Law claiming that the Queensland Parliament can exercise their powers to adversely affect the people. And what do they see as giving them the right to do this? Why, the Australia Act. Under Section 2, which defines the powers afforded to the states as being full powers to enact legislation, the Queensland Parliament assumes that its powers are unlimited, even in respect of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia. This style of thinking led to the Australia Act being applied selectively
to avoid constitutional restraints, and to unlawfully exploit both the state and federal systems by introducing circumventing legislation without your consent or knowledge. Here are some examples of this legislation. The Australia Act itself, Constitution of Western Australia, Commonwealth Banks, Reprints Act, Acts Interpretation Act, Land Titles Act, Constitution Bill, Australian Crime Commission, Queensland Act 2003, and many more. And here are some of the key players in this game of your life. And why did they do it? To promote their hidden agenda, the move to a socialist republic. We see that the Australia Act has been accepted and used by parliaments to facilitate a lot of legislation, but it has never been the subject to a judicial determination as to its validity. So let us put forward the question, is it valid? Firstly, let us examine the defined purpose of the Act, which says, an Act to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the States into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. Let us focus on the critical words, which are constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the States, conformity and the word status. Now, this does not create a sovereign, independent and federal nation. It merely brings constitutional arrangements into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. This is a cleverly structured wording suggesting that the Australia Act creates a sovereign, independent and federal nation, and that it empowers the federal and state parliaments to govern this new nation under its provisions. It now becomes evident how Bob Hawke managed to configure his alternative means of achieving our objectives, and how the Australia Act became a veil over our Constitution to enable the parliaments, and especially the state parliaments, to pass legislation without any regard for the constraints of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia. Perhaps we should now look at the Constitution to see what made them go to such length to circumvent it. Firstly, we should note that the true Constitution is the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act of 1901. It creates the Commonwealth of Australia right here in its opening statement, which says, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and under the Constitution hereby established. We have just read a definition that states it is the people under this Constitution that are the Commonwealth of Australia. And that is simply why there can be no change to the Constitution or even to the constitutional arrangements without the consent of the people. That is also why anyone who follows an agenda that is alien to that of the Constitution must find alternative means to bypass this impenetrable safeguard of the people's rights. Impenetrable because it is of the people. And that is why Bob Hawke brought in the Australia Act, to veil the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, which would cover up Whitlam's crime of using the Statute Law Revision Act of 1973 to remove the words the Commonwealth of and of the Commonwealth from federal legislation, to create an independent pseudo-nation called Australia. A hollow, make-believe nation with no people. How could there be any people when they are in the Commonwealth of Australia? And no assets. These all belong to the Commonwealth of Australia, the people. But that doesn't matter, because the name Australia has been in common use forever, and it creates an excellent decoy to the Commonwealth of Australia. It is the alternative means Bob Hawke was looking for. But still, that question has not been answered. Is it valid? Let's go straight to the rule of law, something our courts appear to have walked away from. Firstly, we see a hint of treachery against the Commonwealth. The Crimes Act 1914 at section 24AA states, "A person shall not do any act or thing with intent to overthrow the Constitution of the Commonwealth." And at section 24AA3 it defines that such an act is an indictable offence called treachery, with the most severe penalty, imprisonment for life. Then we note that this act involves changes to constitutional arrangements without the consent of the people. To get this act into effect, all the state parliaments had to enact the Australia Acts Request Act, yet there was no referendum held in any state. Nevertheless, each state passed an Australia Acts Request Act in 1985. It becomes obvious then that the Prime Minister Bob Hawke and all the premiers conspired against the Commonwealth, the people. The third point was raised by Michael Kirby, a High Court judge who argued that the Australia Act was invalid because it made amendment to the state constitutions of Queensland and Western Australia, making it inconsistent with section 106 of the Commonwealth Constitution, and therefore not a valid exercise of Commonwealth legislative power. And just to put it beyond doubt, we find that the states could not validly enact the Requests Acts, not only because of the lack of a referendum, but also because each Requests Act invalidated itself at section 5B of its own first schedule, and could not be used as lawful legislation to support the request for and thereby the enactment of the Australia Act. This comes about because Section 5 limits the legislative powers of the states granted under Section 2. It clearly states that Section 2 is subject to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, and that the powers under Section 2 do not operate so as to give any force or effect to a provision of an Act of a Parliament of a state that would repeal, amend or be repugnant to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. Here is an Act that clearly states that no provision of an Act can be given any force or effect if it is repugnant to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. But the whole aim of each Australia Act Requests Act is to give effect to legislation that is deleterious to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. And this makes each Australia Act Request Act repugnant to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, and under Section 5B of their own first schedule they cannot be given any force or effect and are therefore invalid. We keep referring to the lack of a referendum in respect of the Australia Acts Request Acts because it is essential to both them and the Australia Act itself. At Section 6, which is common in both the federal and the state legislations, we see that any law made in respect of the Constitution or powers or procedures of the Parliament of the state shall be of no force or effect unless it is made in such manner and form as required by a law made by that Parliament, whether made before or after the commencement of this Act. Or put simply, such a law is invalid if it is not made in the manner and form required by a law made by that Parliament. And the correct manner and form to enact certain legislation in Queensland included the need to go to a referendum. This was entrenched in the Queensland Constitution at the various sections mentioned earlier, and especially at Section 53. All of this was in force both before and after the Australia Acts Request Act was enacted by the Parliament. It should be noted that former Premier of Queensland, Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen, foresaw the intentions of the Labor Party to move to National Socialism by stealth and put a bill to Parliament to strengthen the entrenchment of the need for a referendum to enact certain legislation.
Here is a transcript of some of his speech in the House of Representatives, as recorded in Hansard on the 7th of December 1977. Few people in Queensland want a republic, especially the Socialist Republic which so many Labor people appear to want. We do not want a government of this state at any time taking advantage of the people to produce a republic by stealth. If the people want it, then they should be able to clearly indicate so at a referendum. Only if the people of Queensland vote for a change will it be possible for Australia as a whole to become a republic, because you cannot change the monarchy in one part of Australia unless you change it in the whole. To entrench the present system, the bill provides that none of its clauses can be altered by Parliament unless the bill is first presented to the people by way of referendum as prescribed in this bill. The requirement of entrenchment in section 53 is also itself entrenched, so that the guarantee cannot be undone, such as has been done in other parts of the Commonwealth of Nations, where a republican form of government has been brought about contrary to the Constitution. It becomes obvious then that the Queensland Parliament failed to uphold the correct manner and form to enact the Australia Acts Request Act 1985. This renders the Act invalid. And because this Act is invalid, the federal government under Bob Hawke had no right to invoke section 51 of the Commonwealth Constitution, as not all the states had made a valid request for a change in legislation. The result is there were no valid grounds for the Australia Act to be enacted. With all this to confront him, what could Bob Hawke say if we asked the question, is the Australia Act valid? An alternative means for what? To have state parliaments enact draconian laws such as suggested by Crown Law Queensland? We have now seen enough to be able to answer the question as to whether they can do this. And the answer is no. No state can give any effect or force to a provision of or an act that is repugnant to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. This indicates that there is no lawful alternative means, only a criminally intended one. And this is fully supported by the opinion of a High Court judge who, as we have already seen, stated that the Constitution gives citizens an immunity from being adversely affected by such laws or the exercise of those powers. The facts are clear. We the people are protected and will be, but only for as long as we are prepared to challenge any invalid legislation such as the Australia Act. The preservation of our rights is our duty, because the custodians of our rights under the Constitution, the judiciary, and in particular the High Court of Australia, are not doing their duty. A mystery to the average person is, why invent such legislation? It's invalid and could lead to a charge of treachery. Is that why Whitlam got rid of the death penalty and revised the legislation relating to treason? One thing that does emerge quite noticeably is that it could achieve the goal of making Australia a republic, and that would create the perfect opportunity for the ALP Fabians to get rid of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, which had been troubling them since 1947, according to Bob Hawke. Rumour has it that both Whitlam and Fraser were collaborating on the formation of a republic, right up until Whitlam was sacked as Prime Minister in 1975. This would have thrown a spanner in the works, and rather than expose their hand, Bob Hawke created the Australia Act to manipulate a move towards the Republic. A leadership spill saw Hawke superseded by Paul Keating, who indicated that he would like to achieve making Australia a republic prior to the centenary of Federation in 2001. He lost the 96 election to John Howard, but nothing changed. Howard arranged a referendum on the question of becoming a republic. It was held on the 6th of November 1999. It was defeated. In spite of everything possible being done to ensure a move to a republic, the media promoted it relentlessly to the embarrassing point where a British politician and journalist, Bill Deeds, reported in the Daily Telegraph on November 8, 1999.
I have rarely attended elections in any country, certainly not in a democratic one, in which the newspapers have displayed a more shameful bias. One and all, they determined that Australians should have a republic, and they used every device towards that end. And to this day, the media is the parliamentary propaganda machine. There is no reporting on the both sides of an issue. The people are told only what the Parliament wants them to know. Now, this is not new. It's a favourite ploy of totalitarian societies such as those mentioned here, mainly to dumb down the masses and tell them what's good for them without telling them the truth. But let's get back to the build-up to a republic. They were so confident that this would happen that copious pages of legislation were prepared in readiness to give the Parliament power over the people. This would achieve a complete reversal of what the Constitution provides, the people having power over the Parliament. Imagine the dilemma when the referendum was defeated: shred or save? Well, not all this preliminary work was wasted. Queensland Premier Peter Beattie used the exercise as an opportunity to make Queensland a separatist state by putting together the preparatory work done in the 6 years of the Goss-Rudd government and during the term of the Borbidge government, with the strategies proposed for the framing of a republic. And one of his priorities was to remove the 1867 Constitution of Queensland and replace it with the Constitution of Queensland 2001. To fly under the radar, Peter Beattie told Parliament that this was simply to consolidate and modernise the Queensland Constitution to bring it into the modern era. No one in the House questioned him, and no one told the people. And this mode of stealth continued because the manner in which changes, or in Labor terms, reforms, were effected was designed to be unnoticeable, especially in fundamental legislation. This included keeping any confrontational issues covert by using notations. For example, if the right of referendum is removed, this would be very confrontational, wouldn't it? Well, check this out. The requirements of a referendum as established under the Constitution Act 1867, the Constitution Act Amendment Act 1890 and the Constitution Amendment Act 1934 are removed on the very first page. Let's look at Section 3 of this new Queensland Constitution. We see that the purpose of the Act is to declare, consolidate and modernise the Constitution of Queensland. This is followed by a note. However, this Act does not consolidate the following constitutional provisions because of the special additional procedures, including approval by the majority of electors at a referendum that may be required. Constitution Act 1867, Sections 1, 2, 2A, 11A, 11B and 53. Constitution Act Amendment Act 1890, Section 2. Constitution Act Amendment Act 1934, Sections 3 and 4. Further, this Act does not consolidate the Constitution Act 1867, Sections 30 and 40. But you may well say, this is only a note, until you refer to Section 5, which states, a note in text is part of this Act. And this is here obviously to give full effect to Section 3, which we have just considered. Which leads us to realise that the purpose of this Act has been misstated. It should refer to the removal of constitutional provisions that include approval by the majority of electors at a referendum, a right granted to the people of Queensland by the valid 1867 Queensland Constitution. Now, in respect of the stated purpose, how do the words declare, consolidate and modernise the Constitution of Queensland apply? Instead, let's consider the words stealth, deceit and treachery. These would appear to be much more appropriate, wouldn't they?
For instance, refer to Section 95 of this 2001 Constitution, which lists the legislation repealed by this Constitution at Schedule 3. Looking down the list, we find the Australia Acts Request Act, 1985, Act number 69 there. This legislation did its job in 1986 when the Australia Act was enacted. So why repeal it on the 6th of June 2002? But more mysteriously, why reprint the Australia Acts Request Act 1985? Remember that a reprint as per the Reprints Act discussed earlier is a diabolical law enabling legislation to be changed at will. Why make change to an act that did its job in 1986 on 19th of July 1994 and then again on the 6th of June 2002, only to repeal it on 6th of June 2002? It seems pointless rewriting a law and effecting change to it when it has no further effect, unless there is something to hide. It therefore seems to be a good idea to check out what was done to it before it was repealed. We have already seen that this Act invalidated itself at Section 5 of its own first schedule. But, oddly enough, there was no change to Section 5. The most important change took place in respect of the preamble. It was entirely removed, and this makes a nonsense of this Act. The copy of the Act you are looking at is the original content of the Act. The note referring to reprinting is not as per the Reprints Act, which had not yet been effected, but a true copy of the original reprinted. In the original wording, we see a preamble consisting of 5 paragraphs, with each of paragraphs 2, 3 and 4 being repeated almost word for word at sections 2, 3 and 4 of the Act. At first glance, the omission of the first 4 paragraphs of the preamble may suggest that this is merely a tidy-up action. The definition above the preamble is similar to the first paragraph, except that it names those responsible for initiating the need for this Act. The provisions in paragraphs 2, 3 and 4 are contained in sections 2, 3 and 4 respectively. But really, why would you bother? The Act achieved what it was set out to achieve and can't be used again. Why would you do an amending reprint unless there was something incriminating in the original Act? Perhaps paragraph 5? Well, this is what paragraph 5 states. Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Queensland in Parliament assembled, and by the authority of same. What we have here is the clause that enacts this legislative bill. It defines who enacted the bill and under whose authority it was enacted. Paragraph 5 creates the Act which is presented for assent. Without it, the bill remains a bill and is not a valid Act. By removing this enactment clause, the Australia Act Requests Act 1985 becomes invalid. It is not enacted and it is not authorised, which then invalidates the Australia Act, as it means the stated requirement under paragraph 51 of the Commonwealth Constitution that all states must request the enactment of the Australia Act was not met. On this basis, it invalidates the Australia Act. The most likely motive for the removal of the enactment clause is that something in the wording could have been considered incriminating, and its removal could cover this up. Having been carried out in 1994 during the Gosrud era, this amendment suggests it carries the crud hallmark: theoretical, impractical and poor execution with negative impacts. So which of the words used in paragraph 5 were problematic? How is it that the following could be considered offensive?
The first phrase obviously refers to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and not the Queen of Australia as established under Gough Whitlam's Royal Style and Titles Act of 1973. In the next wording, the Legislative Assembly is the House of Representatives. Members here are elected to represent the people. And thirdly, the authority under which this was enacted must not have been available. There is no way the Parliament could have explained the need for the Act to the people. So they took it upon themselves to push it through. But the words that were used clearly indicate that this is a Parliament of representatives of the people and would require consent, which was not sought. It was obviously considered important to cover up that this invalid act was enacted without the appropriate authority. And this brings out an allegation of culpable intent, both when the legislation was enacted and when the cover-up took place. Not only did the cover-up discredit those who affected it, it invalidated the legislation it was supposed to validate by removing the enactment clause, a demonstration of complete contempt for both the people and the rule of law by parliamentarians in the pursuit of their own agenda. We have seen that the Constitution of Queensland 2001 drew on the Australia Act for Empowerment, but because it removed the rights of the people, it was repugnant to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution and is invalid at Section 5 of the very Act it used for support. This Constitution has alienated all Queensland courts from being Chapter 3 courts under the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution, which poses dire consequences for the law in Queensland. And as mentioned, it's removed rights and liberties that had been guaranteed under the 1867 Queensland Constitution, especially the rights of referendum. So what else has it done? It has kicked the Crown entirely out of its content, so that there's no mention of the Crown in the Constitution of Queensland. Maybe you're not sure about that. Well, let's go back to the first page again and check Section 4. Here we find that this Constitution defines references to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as references to the Sovereign. A reference in this Act to the Sovereign is a reference to the Queen or King for the time being and, if necessary, includes the Queen's or King's heirs and successors. This cannot be a reference to the Queen of Australia, as the Queen of Australia cannot be a king or have heirs or successors. We also note there is no definition of the Crown in the 2001 Queensland Constitution. Specific reference to the Crown is made in the amendment stated in its Schedule 2, where it amends Section 33 1A of the Acts Interpretation Act 1954 as follows. The word Crown is omitted and replaced by the word State. This would have been deemed a necessary amendment as the 2001 Constitution created Ministers of the State at Chapter 3, Part 3, Sections 42 and 43. A strange move, as Ministers of the State have no parliamentary privilege. It also became necessary to create the State, which it does at Chapter 3, Part 5, Section 51, giving it all the powers and legal capacity of an individual. If we refer to the Acts Interpretation Act 1954, an individual is defined as being a natural person. So is this another nonsense or the creation of an opportunity to be used as and when required to maintain deception and stealth? Because the powers of the state are not limited inside and outside Queensland and inside and outside Australia. An interesting point is, why was the Acts Interpretation Act used to replace the Crown by the state when the 2001 Constitution had already defined the state and the fact that ministers were now ministers of the state? Because the Acts Interpretation Act is used as a reference for all Queensland legislation and it can be used unnoticeably to give effect to reforms of a sensitive nature. It is just a stealthy way of replacing the Crown in Queensland legislation with the state, so that the Crown has no effect other than what the state wants it to have in any given situation. It is by no means now a separate power. In the 1999 referendum, all 6 states and the Northern Territory voted to retain the Crown, commonly identified with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The Queensland vote was 62.56% for the monarchy. There's no way the Queensland Parliament could admit to removing the Crown without a backlash from the people, so they tried to disguise this by cleverly manoeuvring the Crown as essentially the body politic of the sovereign. Refer this letter by Nick Williams, Senior Policy Advisor, Office of the Premier, Queensland Government. In simple terms, the Crown is hidden in legislation and represented by various entities such as the Brigalow Corporation in the Lands Act, or the Coordinator General in the State Development and Public Works Organisation Act, or the Chief Executive in any other act that may be chosen. To get a grasp on this, let's look at the Land Act, which was amended in 1992 by the Lands Legislation Amendment Act. On page 7 of this Amendment Act, the Brigalow Corporation was created. It was defined as representing the Crown, and it was given all the privileges and immunities of the Crown. Thus, the Crown, being the body politic of the sovereign, is now entombed within the Brigalow Corporation. To what purpose? Well, to try and understand this, let's look a little further into the Land Act. In the very next section, we see that the Brigalow Corporation is the Chief Executive. Sounds like one person constitutes the Brigalow Corporation, which represents the Crown. So who could this Chief Executive be? We really need to know more. To find out, let us turn to page 7 of this Act. We note that under Corporation 4.1 that the continuation of the Land Administration Commission is under the structure of a corporation sole called the Brigalow Corporation. By definition, a corporation sole is a one-person corporation administered without a board of directors, without ownership shares, and without diffusion of control. Now, in the very next section, 4.2, we see that the Brigalow Corporation is a body corporate, with a seal and may sue or be sued under its corporate name. This still holds with the definition of a corporation sole, as such entity is also a single sole incorporated office occupied by a single sole person. Thus, our assumption that the Chief Executive is one person fits this description. Something we need to know about the corporation sole is that it has a separate and continuing legal existence, which means that it passes from the incumbent office holder to a successor with no other changes. So any contract executed by a corporation sole also passes on to the successor. But we still have to ask this question, as further in the Act we find a reference to the Chief Executive Lands, who is stated as being the Chief Executive within the meaning of the Lands Act 1962. So we searched the Lands Act 1962 to 88 and found no definition of a Chief Executive. The only mention was in the Land Legislation Amendment Act 1992, amending the Land Act of 1962 to make any reference to the Land Administration Commission, its Secretary or the Chief Commissioner of Lands, a reference to the Chief Executive. Then we found more references to the Chief Executive. As a Chief Executive of a department, to do with surveys the meaning is as in the Surveyors Act of 1977. In respect of valuations, it's in the Valuation of Land Act 1944. But in the amendments, we find a member of the Commission becomes a Chief Executive. Even the Commission itself becomes a Chief Executive. And wow, here's the best one of all. And it becomes the Chief Executive. Does that tell you who the Chief Executive is? I don't think so. Yet this is a person who's been given total control by legislation. That means control of all assets, including all land titles, and the opportunity to use these assets as security for borrowings, such as bond issues in the New York Stock Exchange. Can't imagine who wields such power. Can you? This totally unconstrained power and control over the state of Queensland, this is the entity that is a state under the Commonwealth Constitution, has enabled it to be transformed into a separatist state under the Constitution of Queensland 2001 and alien to the Commonwealth Constitution. And this is a legacy to the Brigalow Corporation and how it was manipulated. To avoid detection before sufficient power was assumed, politicians used gradualism, the Fabian concept of moving in small increments by stealth and deceit over a protracted period of time. The warning by Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen in 1977 was not enough to set up vigilance in protecting our legislation. 15 years later, the stage was set, and the changes made began to achieve a vital strategic point, the removal of the cornerstone of our democratic safeguards, the Crown.
Yet we get the impression that everything has stayed the same. This is good old Queensland. The Governor and the judiciary are there to protect us, and the Crown is still the foundation of our democracy. But what we must realise is that what we see is not the Crown. It's only a facade, because there are many crowns in the legislation. What we see is a nothing crown. The real power of the Crown has been stolen by the Premier. A move that has allowed the 1867 Constitution to be replaced by the Queensland Constitution of 2001, and one that has also placed the Governor and the judiciary under the control of the state, as we shall now see. We have just seen many changes that have been engineered to impact on the entities that were originally established as safeguards to our democratic rights and liberties. Firstly, the Governor, who was set up as a representative of the Crown, and also the judiciary, originally set up as representatives of the Crown. Both these entities are now under the control of the state, under the nothing crowns in legislature and the Queensland Constitution Act of 2001. This gives total control and creates a totalitarian state in which there is no separation of powers. The Governor, the judiciary and the Constitution are all under government control.
This now gives us an explanation as to why Premier Peter Beattie said to the press, "I am unaccountable," and why Premier Anna Bligh ignored the people's will, as demonstrated in the plebiscites on council amalgamations, and said, "We are doing it anyway." Have you ever tried to complain about that? Have you noticed how the media is suppressed? Interesting. And also, while we're there, let's notice how legislation has been passed to allow trial without a jury for special cases and other purposes, and also legalised phone tapping. Now, how about we test your memory and ask the question, how many of these social characteristics apply in the state of Queensland today? 1. Total power placed in the hands of one entity. 2. The state rules over everything. 3. People have no democratic rights. 4. The state has power over the judiciary. 5. The state changes laws to suit itself. 6. Trial without a jury. 7. Communications scrutinised, phones tapped. 8. Control over the media. How many of these do you think apply in Queensland today? Now, while you're thinking of that, let's just have a look at two other societies of the 20th century that featured these very same characteristics and more. They were, of course, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. Under their respective leaders, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, regimes of suppression and terror were established, and these regimes have been known throughout history, and their events recorded, and oddly enough they were characterized by the following characteristics. So, how many of these did you say apply in Queensland today? Total power, number one, yes. State rules over everything, yes. No democratic rights, yes. Power over judiciary, changes to laws, trial without a jury, communication, phones tapped, media control, and the last we're not sure about. But taking into account all the characteristics that were similar, obviously it would appear that our state government has turned Queensland into a totalitarian state. Don't think there's a redemption because one characteristic has not been confirmed, and that one of political opponents and dissidents disappearing. First, we have to consider the following.
This piece of legislation is currently in force. If you wish to check, just go to the Queensland Government website and look up Legislation in Force under the letter A. It has been in force since the 7th of November 2004, even though it hasn't been proclaimed yet. If you read the Act, you'll probably think it hasn't commenced yet, because of this section, which tells you that this Act commences on a day to be fixed by proclamation. But this Act was assented to on the 6th of November 2003, and under the provisions of the Act's Interpretation Act of 1954, at Section 15DA2, it automatically commenced 1 year and 1 day after its assent date. It did commence on the 7th of November 2004. You should have noticed that this was another means of using the Act's Interpretation Act as a mechanism of stealth. This protocol did not commence until the 25th of May 1994, when the Act was reprinted for the 5th time and Section 15DA2 was added. Please note, here we see how the insidious Reprints Act is being used to create another weapon of stealth to be used to manipulate legislation. A planned progression by Goss and Rudd? What do you think? When any postponed legislation is automatically commenced 1 year and 1 day after the assent date. Is it any wonder that acts like the Australian Crime Commission Queensland Act become law without public knowledge, totally unnoticed? This particular act became law on 7 November 2004, even though it was never proclaimed, which saved it from being publicly announced. If the government didn't want us to know about it, we have to ask why. Is it because it has something to hide? Let's find out for ourselves.
In Part 1, Section 3, we find a very interesting concept being presented by this Act. If the head of an ACC operation or investigation suspects that an offence that is not a serious and organised crime may be directly or indirectly connected with or be part of a course of activity involving the commission of a serious and organised crime, whether or not the head has identified the nature of that serious and organised crime, then the incidental offence is, for as long as the head so suspects, taken for the purposes of this Act to be a serious and organised crime. Please note that the ACC head can invoke this law on suspicion and have you charged without proof. So, having been charged and being a straightforward citizen, you can look forward to due process of justice. Or can you? You won't get a trial, and there will be no hearing. You'll just get an examination. And at your examination, the conduct will be regulated by an examiner, not a judge, not a magistrate. And the examiner may regulate the conduct of proceedings at an examination as the examiner thinks fit. That's right, as the examiner thinks fit. No due process of law here. And what about search warrants under this Act? Well, they can now be obtained by phone, and they can be signed off by the investigator, the person who actually wants the warrant. And your summons. It can now be issued with a notice of non-disclosure. What does that mean? Simply that disclosure of information about the summons or notice or any official matter connected with it is prohibited, except in the circumstances, if any, specified in the notation. Well, where does that leave you? And that's only a part. There are many other parts of this legislation that must give cause for concern. It should, in fact, make you afraid. This legislation empowers people outside the Queensland Police Force and the Federal Police Force. So what is the state government seeking to establish? Another enforcement agency? History has shown us that this type of enforcement agency has not been of great benefit to a community. In fact, it has been quite detrimental. The Queensland that we knew and grew up in has been taken away from us. The state government, as we've seen through this slideshow, has stolen our democracy. So, what's going to replace it? Shall we just sit and wait and see, or do we do something about it? If we don't protect the Queensland we knew, how are you and I going to explain to our children the mess that we've left them with?